Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session on editing for style and voice for HAS. That stands for Humanities and Social Sciences. So if you're in those disciplines, this video is for you. And if you're at the final stages of your PhD, this is a good workshop for you to think about the final steps in polishing your work, but also, editing and revising quite deeply, first of all, as well. So there'll be various techniques covered in this workshop to go through how to, in a systematic way, to go through how to edit for style and voice. So we'll be talking about editing versus proofreading and what the difference is and how you can go through a very rigorous and comprehensive editing process using this pyramid. And we'll be going over that a bit more so you really understand the importance of looking at argument first of all, understanding your overall argument, your chapter arguments, the arguments of your different sections within chapters, and then thinking about that structure and how the structure supports that overall argument as well as the arguments within chapters, etc. Then we can think about your paragraphs and how they work to support up the chain, to support your structure, to support your argument. And then there'll be a long session, along a kind of number of slides in order to go over expression. So we want to look at expression last. There's no reason to really focus on making your word choices and sentences beautiful if you have no argument and the whole chapter is completely descriptive and explanatory. It doesn't matter how beautifully expressed it is. It's not going to really cut it when it comes to the requirements of a thesis, which is to present an argument. So we need to look at expression last, but there's a lot you can look at and do with expression in order to really highlight your points more carefully, to make your meaning really explicit, to help the reader follow along much more clearly with your argument. So the final part that we will discuss is how to edit for that kind of expression work. And that's really where your style and voice will come across as well, with your word choice and with your sentence structure. So we'll be going through that quite a bit, but bear in mind, that's not something you need to do until the very end. And then you also need to, spend quite a bit of time on it. So if we were in a live session, we would be discussing what makes editing your own work challenging for you. What strategies have you found to be helpful? And, what academic work inspires you that you think is particularly well written? And so I'll answer those questions. So for the first one, I think what makes editing your own work so challenging, and it's something, I've learned to try to battle this challenge, but the real challenge is that you're so used to reading it and you know the content so well, it's hard to know how another mind will take in this information and how well you're communicating what you want to communicate to this other mind, this reader. So the best thing to do to get in the headspace of another mind is to have other people read it so you can start to understand how other minds are reacting to your work and how they understand what you are articulating and arguing. That's why we're here as learning advisors at Academic Skills. We often serve as that check-in point for PhD students and all students at ANU so that they can kind of get that sense of how they are communicating through words. And it's often that we're saying to students, when you wrote this is what I thought. Is that what you meant? And, we can go through that. And you can do that with us. You can do that with other people as well. But it helps to embed in your mind how other people react to your writing. And that's what we all need in order to be able to look at our work with that distance that we need to look at it with. We need to be able to try to get outside of our own brain as best we can. And the way to do that is to practice understanding how other brains receive our work, which is by receiving feedback. Another strategy to help with that is to get distance. So work on chapter 2, finish it up, start on chapter 3. A few weeks later, look back at chapter 2 with fresh eyes. When you look at it again after as long as you can wait, if as possible, 24 hours being the smallest amount of time, but, a week or two, and you've picked up something else, and then you come back to that, you'll really see it with fresh eyes. And that's what we need for editing. We need fresh eyes to be able to do all the things that we're going to be discussing, all the techniques that we'll be discussing in covering the rest of these slides. Another strategy that I have used is to not just look at it on my Word document. Like if I'm always on Word document, reading it again in that same document might seem too familiar. So maybe printing it out, maybe like sending it to your iPad or to your Kindle. Like I have a Kindle, so I would send it to my Kindle, which is where I read like published books. So if I'm going to now read what I wrote in a format where I read published books, I'm already reading it with a different mindset. I'm already thinking of this work and its standard in relation to what I usually read on that Kindle, which is public works of, publishable quality. So trying to change up the format as you edit is also a strategy I have found helpful. And another helpful strategy has to do with that third question around academic work that you think is particularly well written. You want to be able to ask yourself questions about that work that's particularly well written, and not just think that's just a really good author. They're very good at communicating, and they have a kind of subconsciously you think they have a natural ability to write really well, and they probably don't have to work that hard at it. So instead of thinking all of that, maybe subconsciously, start to think about how that author whose work you think is really well written has used a lot of skills in order to get across their meaning and ideas and arguments in an effortless way. It takes a lot of effort to make your writing effortless for your reader. And so acknowledging that and looking at trying to break down not just what the argument is and how it's supported, but how they wrote it. What are their topic sentences? How have they supported their topic sentences? What moves have they made? How explicit have they been in how they're supporting their argument, how they're signaling their argument, how they're signaling the various moves within their article, let's say, or book. So trying to ask yourself those questions means you're being critical of the work, but you're not being negative towards it. You're being positive. You're trying to ask yourself those questions of, why is this so good? Why is this so easy to follow? Why does it feel when I read this that it's quite an effortless experience, even though the material is so complicated? So asking yourself those questions will allow you to get a deeper insight into what skills you might need to develop or can apply in your current draft to make that a smoother reading experience. Okay, moving forward, we talked about earlier at the top, the difference between editing and proofreading. So there is a big difference. And as soon as you finish your draft, you're not just going right to proofreading. You're still in the editing phase. The proofreading is only till the very, very end, maybe the final weeks or the final month before submission. But the editing can happen, it depends on your writing process. It can happen all along, or it can happen more towards the end, a deeper edit. But it's, really at that top level of improving 1, argument, 2, structure, 3, paragraphing, and 4, expression, and improving that quality in that order and having a deep dive, a deep look at how the argument is signaled, how the argument is structured, how the paragraphs are working to support that structure, and then how the expression is working. And then at the very end, the proofreading is looking for those typo errors, those inconsistencies in formatting, those referencing checks to make sure your EndNote or Mendeley or Zotero has automated correctly your references. And that's just some, a different way of using your brain, just being quite, meticulous around checking for certain matches, for consistency, for those dots, for those italics, for those quotation marks, for those commas. That's a different way of using your brain than editing. Editing is very deep work where you're really trying to imagine how that other brain is going to be reading your work, how well you are communicating your ideas to that other reader. Whereas proofreading, you're kind of switching your brain to a different focus on consistency of formatting, consistency of referencing guidelines, and looking out for typos. So we can see why that would be something you would do at the very end of your thesis writing process. So as you're editing that deeper process, you want to think about the examiners and keeping them in mind. So they're going to be experts, but they don't know why you've done what you've done in your PhD. They don't know you. They're not going to be at ANU. They're not going to be like totally like that familiar maybe with your supervisor. My examiners certainly didn't know my supervisors. My examiners were overseas. I did my PhD in Australia. My examiners were, I believe, from the US and Canada and taught at those institutions. So they had no idea who I was or who my supervisors were, but and they knew the material, but they didn't know why I did what I did. So I had to make that really clear to my audience in general, as to why I came up with the research questions I did, why I decided to use the methods that I did and justify them, how my arguments for each individual data chapter supported my overall argument. So we've got to provide that context for them to follow along with, signal your intentions as appropriate, really using that signaling language that we'll come to in various slides at the end to really show how we move through your argument, why you made the choices that you did throughout your research journey. And so again, not worrying about what they know. Your job is how to just meet what they know. You're not going to know who they are exactly. It doesn't really matter what they know. What matters is that you can articulate, that you can demonstrate, you fully understand what has happened in your thesis. And you can very clearly, concisely, articulately communicate the significance of your work, the original contribution of your work, and the overall meaning of your work, which is your overall argument or key message from your thesis, your overall findings, however you want to phrase it. So again, this is a good way to think about it. We've seen it listed, these 4 things kind of listed in a certain way, but it's good to think about this graphic as argument at the top, as the biggest thing that then feeds down into the other 3 elements of structure, paragraphing, and expression, and goes back up again to that biggest piece of argument. Everything that you do beyond argument is about supporting that argument. And you won't know really how to structure anything, how to create good paragraphs and how to express those paragraphs clearly without understanding what you want to say, which is your argument. What ties this all together? What is your assertion? What is your claim for the overall thesis? And then how does that relate to your claims for your chapters? Okay, so, that first step of argument, how are you developing your narrative, your key message, your argument, however you want to think of it? How are you developing this key message, this key idea? You're going to signal it. You're going to begin developing that in your abstract. You're going to tell us what you're going to frame the context. You're going to frame the research problem, your key arguments, your key findings, however you want to think about it, as well as the significance of that work, what its contribution is, why it's important. Then in your introduction, you're going to give some deeper context. That's going to lead into identifying the gaps and justifying your aims or your research question, however you're framing it. And then you're thinking about throughout your headings, your topic sentences, how they work to support your main argument and the arguments of each chapters. And you want to think about, conclusions that are going to summarize those key findings and explain the significance of your research. So these are the places where you're going to be introducing and reinforcing that argument. And that's what we as readers are going to be holding on to as we read. We're going to be thinking about, well, this is the purpose of this work. So that's why they included now this piece of evidence. And we need you to be explicit about signaling that argument and signaling how you're supporting that argument. Okay, so thinking about editing for argument more explicitly, that first level of editing, your purpose is to determine if your argument is clear upfront, developed, and convincing in the abstract, in the introduction, and how it is signaled clearly within the beginning of your chapters as well. So some strategies there, checking that the argument is clear in the abstract and introduction, having other people read it, reading other examples of abstracts and introductions to compare how explicit they are versus how explicit you are in signaling your argument. And then, see how it's developed over your headings and topic sentences within your introduction, within your chapters. How is this working at that top level? How are you at the macro level really signaling the development of your argument throughout all of your chapters? And then once you do that, you can move on to editing for structure. Then you can make sure that structure is in the right order, that it makes sense logically, that it has a flow and cohesion to it, that you've signposted why you've moved and how you've moved into the next section, the next piece, the next point of your argument within a chapter. So thinking about signposting at the beginning of your chapters. You're going to signpost in your introduction chapter in general. You're going to have your chapter outline at the end, typically, of your introduction chapter. You're going to provide some key points for each chapter. So it would say, chapter 1 argues this. In chapter 2, I argue, or I show, or I prove, or I demonstrate. You want to use those kinds of verbs. I illustrate, perhaps. You want to use those kinds of verbs more than I examine or I explain. We want to use those strong verbs to show that you are making a clear argument, claim, assertion, whatever words you want to use there, instead of the idea that you are explaining something. We want to know the key message of each chapter in your chapter outlines that would appear at the end of your introduction. At the beginnings of your chapters, you want to have a paragraph or two that introduces the main argument of that chapter, as well as some signposting, an outline, which is an outline of the structure of that chapter. So you'd want to include that within each chapter as well, making sure that's there, making sure that makes sense. That's really logical in support of the key message of the chapter, of the argument of the chapter, and then checking with the headings, checking with your topic sentences, that you have adhered to a good order, the order that you've indicated at the start in the introduction of the chapter. And the signposting doesn't end right when you just indicated in the beginning of your chapter. You want to explicitly show us the moves you're making within the chapter in your topic sentences, the beginnings of sections, and we'll look at some examples, some specific examples of that as we go along. So really thinking about that big picture and narrowing in on editing for paragraphs then. And this would take a long time by itself if you're going to be, dedicating yourself to really investigating each paragraph of all of the paragraphs that you've written in your thesis. But you've got to think about them within the context of the purpose of each chapter, the purpose of each section or subsection within those chapters. And then you can really hone in on how are those topic sentences working? Do they contain the right idea that you want to signal that's relevant to the argument of the section? And, looking at sections as a part of the previous level of looking at structure. How did the sections work in relation to the argument of the chapter? And then how did the paragraphs work in relation to the arguments of the sections that you have already decided you're happy with or revised? So checking those topic sentences, the main idea is really developed and supported with evidence after it, and then you can also be checking your referencing at that time if you'd like. So think about what do I want to say in this paragraph? What is it about? What do I want to show the reader in this paragraph that's part of my larger story of this section? How does it all relate? And do I have evidence to support it? And am I analyzing that evidence? Am I showing why that evidence indeed supports what I'm saying? Or am I just stating evidence and assuming that the reader will make the connection for me? So remember, we want to be reader responsible. No, we want to be writer responsible. We are responsible as writers to the reader to make sure they have a very smooth and easy reading experience, that they are not puzzled or confused. If you provide them with evidence, but you don't state why that evidence supports your argument, you're leaving it up to the reader to make that connection. And they may not feel comfortable doing that. They probably won't. As readers of academia in English language don't feel comfortable typically. That's part of the expectations of writing in English academia, that the reader doesn't feel comfortable filling in those gaps. So that's why the writing that you do needs to be so explicit, because your examiners, your readers do not want to fill in those gaps for you. They don't want to just infer what you might be implying. They might get it wrong. So you've got to make sure you're being as clear as you can be with all of this, but in particular, how your evidence supports what your argument is. Okay, so thinking about your paragraph structure, typically 150 to 200 words. I see a lot of paragraphs that are really short or really long. We want to have a kind of uniform length for our paragraphs. That's what looks most professional and most fits the academic writing style, that you've thought through each of those paragraphs and that you've created well-developed units that are not underdeveloped or overdeveloped. So as you can see, it has, following the metaphor of a beautiful hamburger, you have the top bun, that topic sentence, you have your analysis and evidence, the meat, the cheese, the salad, all of that is your analysis and evidence combined. So it is that not just evidence, but having that analysis too, which is how you interpret the evidence and show us how it supports your point. And that concluding sentence or linking sentence as the bottom bun. So we want it to be that nice, digestible unit. So this is often around 5 to 7 or 8 sentences. So we often see paragraphs that are about 2 or 3 sentences. That looks rather informal. That looks more like internet writing or something like that, which is fine style of writing. It just isn't really compatible with academic style writing. But it's also not incredibly long. It's not, 10 sentences going on for a page and a half. Then it contains too many ideas and isn't that digestible unit anymore and loses its focus. And then the reader loses track of what's going on because there's just too much happening in the paragraph to clearly follow along with. As you can see here, we don't want it underdeveloped and we don't want it overdeveloped. So if we can stick to that range, 150 to 200, 250, is 5 to 8 sentences is the way to get at these, correctly sized units that show that each paragraph is well thought out and one isn't just to kind of dashed off quickly and one isn't not revised and it's just so long and bulky. We want to show that each paragraph is well thought out. Okay, and we also want to make sure we do have our topic sentences. We all want that bun on our hamburgers. And that's another problem we see too. So making sure those topic sentences really frame the point of the paragraph. And you can spend a lot of time editing, just looking at those topic sentences. How are they working? How can they best assert my point here that I want to make? Okay, and then we're thinking about editing for expression. And this can take the longest amount of time. But again, we've got to make sure those upper levels are really clear. You can't just edit for expression, but not know exactly what you want to express, because what you want to express is your argument. So if that's not clear in your mind, then editing for expression is not going to work that well. I mean, we have these words here about being authoritative. What are you going to be authoritative about if you don't really know what it is you want to say about your research? Okay, so we're not just going to be authoritative about, I know everything about the topic and I've read a lot. It's about, that certainly can be the case, but that's certainly not all there is to your research. What your research really is that original data collecting that you've done in whatever way you've done it and what you found. And that's what we mean by being authoritative. And so, as you edit for expression, you can more and more deeply understand what you want to say. So I'm not saying you don't want to do that, but you want to have a go at the top level, first of all, making sure everything is really signaled clearly as to what you're arguing. And then your expression can even more deeply convey that argument and that persuasion to your readers. Okay, so a linguist called Ken Highland came up with this idea of this kind of graphic that you see here, and is saying that meta discourse is key to persuasive academic writing and writing with authority. So thinking about, what words you use and how you use those words in your discipline in order to convey what you want to convey, in order to write with authority, to write with persuasion. So Highland there is thinking about, our interaction, the writer's interaction with the reader, and how we convey our stance and our engagement with the research. So we'll go through some of these stances and some of these ways to engage with the reader through your specific word choices in this next section. So, and they're all kind of categorized in this way through how to really show your authority, to be authoritative, how to be most coherent, how to be precise, concise, and engaging. Okay, so first of all, to be authoritative. So one of the stances is self-mention that Highland came up with. The different ideas about stance is self-mention. So, making yourself clear in your writing. And that's particularly relevant in HAS subjects, humanities and social sciences. That is not frowned upon, as far as I know. I did a social science PhD and a master's in humanities discipline. And in either case, for me, it was quite encouraged to write from, to do these self-mentions where appropriate, not to be self-indulgent or anything like that, or anecdotal, but to, make it clear, this is me talking here. I did this research. This is my main interest, and it's based on, for myself, my PhD was based on some personal experience I had that I then wanted to explore further from an academic standpoint. So I was able to say that in my introduction, for example. But thinking about different ways you might self-mention to be authoritative in your writing around your own connection to the research and why you carried it out. My main interest in making this analysis, it is only prudent to acknowledge, you're not having a self-mention there, but it is only prudent to acknowledge, but it is clearly the author's viewpoint that they are trying to get across. It is their stance that they're trying to get across, right? It is only prudent to acknowledge. Someone might disagree. They're making an assertion there about their own point of view. I offer these observations to illustrate how. So, just it feels like when we do the self-mention that you are, and you won't do it like every single sentence. It doesn't need to be, it's all of these are with a light touch, but it does feel like when we read those as academic readers that you are taking us by the hand and leading us through your argument and your points, right? I offer these observations to illustrate, like, I'm doing this because I want to show you this, rather than just saying, here it is, here's what I'm showing you, and saying, here's why I'm showing you this. And that's important. That's helpful to the reader to feel like we are in good hands. We are in safe hands. We are with someone who's going to kindly and engagingly and clearly lead us through their argument and the worth of their research. Okay, so there's also something called hedges, where you can be reluctant to present information categorically, and that's okay too. I'm not saying, you want to present a strong argument, but you can't obviously present all of your findings or all of your points in a very categorical fashion. So sometimes you need to avoid making bold assertions within your chapters, certainly within your conclusion to your whole thesis. I can see this really being used a lot in terms of your ideas for future research, your ideas for the implications of your research. That's something you certainly can't be certain about, but that you can present as an assertion, but with some hedging. So, having that degree of caution and embeds that respect for the reader, that you're not just going to make kind of very, very strong claims all the time, but that you are very carefully considering what kind of bold assertions you can make, and what needs to be hedged. So let's look at some examples there, just using those words like may, shape, the model suggests, and all of those word choices, you're probably using hedges in your writing already. These are very common words, but now you might think about being more, now that you're aware of this, you might be more explicit about how you use those hedges. Are they always appropriate, or are you being too reluctant in your research? Or, the opposite, are you being too strong and you kind of need to use more of a hedge instead? Or you can just notice where you're using them and say, wow, I'm doing that well. I'm using the hedges correctly. That is what I want to say. And that's, a boost and a confirmation of your writing style as it is. And then to continue on from hedges, there are boosters. To, as opposed to hedges, imply that certainty, emphasize the force of what you're proposing. So those types of words listed there can reinforce your authority as a writer when you can, and these are certainly used sparingly as well, but when you can, they certainly make an impact. So it is clear, therefore, and is even more tenuous. So sorry, there they are for you guys. Sorry. So there are the examples there for those boosters. I'm sure you can find others that you're using within your chapters and drafts, and see where those words are, and see if you're using them in the right way, what you really want to boost, and if there are any other places where you can boost. I was often a fan of using "it is clear," or "clearly," or "indeed." I used a lot in my thesis as well. It was a while ago. I'm not sure I would write it exactly the same way nowadays, but I remember using "indeed" a lot and "clearly" a lot. And, when I did want to boost what I was saying and, really point out what I thought to be, my findings and what I wanted to point out as support for my various arguments. Okay, so you can put these together, right? It might seem far-fetched, but it is a valuable exercise. Okay, so we've got that hedge to begin with, highlighted or written in blue, and then the booster after that, but it is valuable. So it's nice to have those kinds of sentences as well that do quite a bit of work, that are quite complex, that, cover those various stances and make that ultimate argument. It is a valuable exercise, but have that hedging too, acknowledging that kind of counter idea. It might seem far-fetched, but it is valuable. Although there's this, I'm arguing this. Despite this, we still found this, and that those are nice ways to acknowledge some of the limitations, perhaps, but continue to boost the value of your findings and your argument. Okay, so there's something else called attitude markers to kind of show your feeling, your attitude towards the various things that you're writing about. So, these types of words, again, you would not use them very, very often, but they can be powerful when using them to really indicate your attitude towards the work and towards the literature. This can be quite useful and powerful in the kinds of lit review chapters, or within your chapters where you're still, using the literature to bolster what you're discussing. So looking at that example, this was not surprising. Okay, so letting us know how this author felt about the findings. And, we can also see that used to take a stance towards the literature, who you are aligned with, who you support, and who you, take some disagreement with. Okay, your reporting verbs can also help to show your stance, particularly towards the literature. So, these kind of different ones. This is an author fall delighted in contrasting public pronouncements. Okay, so rather than just stated, that they something about the contrast of public pronouncements. It's not so neutral. So maybe you don't always want to be neutral in your reporting verbs. To say proposes, concludes, has thoroughly researched, that's going to show, that adverb there, thoroughly, is going to then show your stance as well, that you align with the research, that you, believe in its findings, that it was done well and done comprehensively. So different options there to show your stance towards the work that you are reporting on. Okay, and then thinking about how best to create cohesion in your writing, how to create flow. This is one of the best things you can do for your writing to develop your skills in order to make the reading experience really smooth for your readers. So thinking about those transition words, you use all these words, I am very sure, in your drafts. Now think about how you use them, how to maybe use them more, how to maybe use them better, but overall using them explicitly now, rather than just potentially having some because you thought of it one day, but maybe you missed a few another day. Now you can look at, how am I using these transitional phrases, these cohesive devices, whatever you want to call them, at the beginning, usually at the beginning of sentences, to help the reader follow along with your complex information. So the order of first, second, third is helpful, helping the reader along with logic of how one thing follows from the next, how to, understand what you're contrasting, how to clarify, how to add more information, how to conclude. All that is so helpful to the reader, and it's just what we can hold on to as we follow along with. Everyone's PhD is so complicated. So, we need that help as being readers, even experts in the field. We need that help to follow along with exactly what you did in your very complex research project. So here's some examples of how those work. That, however, were initially captivated, yet theory alone cannot explain. That's why so many readers were ultimately convinced. Okay, so we've got that, time initially and then ultimately, as well as that yet in there that helps us pivot and, understand the contrast. I, on the other hand, another contrast. So there's plenty of these that you will read in your, that you could read in journal articles or other example theses. Be on the lookout for those and how they're used in your discipline, and how you can best use these kinds of transition words in your writing as well. There are frame markers as well, where you're kind of doing a style of signposting, particularly in the later ones. But that first bullet point, in a nutshell, you're telling us, this is my big summary that is going to be obviously, also framing the scope of the summary as quite short, but it is an overall summary. That's helpful to provide to the reader, to use a phrase like that. In a nutshell, here's what Wilkinson theorizes and demonstrates. To frame it with the article is divided into 3 parts is very helpful too. What is part 1? What is part 2? What is part 3? That helps us understand the logic going forward. That helps us read part 1, understand how it connects to part 2 and part 3. So giving us that frame marker is very helpful. And then, to follow up with those first, second, third. Okay, and there's more to cohesion as well. This is what I think of as the most important element of cohesion, the old before new rule. So putting old information that you've already stated in the previous sentence in the beginning of your sentence, and the new information that you haven't stated yet in the previous sentence at the end of the sentence. So look at this example. Anne conducted a research study in the social sciences. In Dubai, she interviewed 20 people. That doesn't quite cohere because it doesn't follow the old before new rule. Anne conducted a research study in the social sciences. And then we start with in Dubai. which is the place, and that's new information. So we don't need that new information to be at the beginning. That's not following the old before new rule. This one would. Anne conducted a research study in the social sciences. As part of her study, she interviewed 20 people in Dubai. If you follow along this old before new rule, that's probably one of the best things you can do to make your writing really smooth and clear to your reader. And when you read work that you really like and can very easily follow along with, it's because typically the main reason is because they're following this rule. This allows you to really follow along in a way that seems mysterious, that seems like, oh, they're just a good author, but this is actually how they're doing it. So we can see in that first sentence, they talk about a research study, right? Anne's conducting this research study. And then in the first part of the second sentence, as part of her study. So we've got the old information in the beginning of that second sentence. So that second one does follow the old before new rule. And we can see it going further here. As part of her study, she interviewed 20 people in Dubai. Now that becomes the old information. And so how can we use some of that old information in the first part of our next sentence? While interviewing people, we know she interviewed people. While interviewing people, now what's our new information? What did she interview them about? She asked them questions about their national identity. The interviewees answered that they felt pride in their national language of Arabic. So we've got it all tied together there with the old before new rule. So see how best you can follow along with that. Maybe just changing the order of some of your sentences around to follow that more carefully. Okay, and then we want to think about using really precise language, word choice. So these types of pronouns, it, there, this, that, these, those, they're overused and they can be really confusing. So you want to be clear and use concrete nouns along with these vague pronouns or instead of these vague pronouns to keep being precise and keep clarifying what you mean. So this kind of sentence, he sat on it and started chewing it while they wondered whether it was safe. We don't know what the it is. What in the world are you talking about? There is no sign of that yet. You know, it requires us to have looked at the previous sentence and be really clear on what the that is. The previous sentence probably has several nouns and to choose from, and we may get it wrong as to what that is, or we may more often than not get it right, but we have to do the work as readers to figure out, look back at the previous sentence and try to work out which noun that is referring to. And that's making us do work. And we don't want to do that as readers, because you as the writer are responsible to us as readers to make it really smooth. And if you make us go back to try to figure something out, we're puzzled and we're feeling a bit down. We're feeling like you're not leading us through this as carefully as we would like. So say what the pronoun refers to. What is that noun? What accounts for this steady upward trend? Not just what accounts for this, right? We define the concept of political style as, not we define the concept as, but what is the concept of political style? The inspiration for this research came from, not just the inspiration came from, okay? Keep clarifying. It's not repetitive. The reader really needs those concrete nouns, those actual nouns, not just pronouns, to follow along, to really be always sure that they're following along carefully. Okay, and being concise. So you might have some lengthy sentences. There are plenty of ways, even though I'm saying with the pronouns to add words and to add the concrete nouns, there are still plenty of places where you're probably, using too many words, and they could be cut down into shorter, into less words. I'm doing that now with a writing project. I'm always like, as I'm, starting writing and refining a bit of some of the pieces and sections that I'm writing, I'm finding ways to continually make it more concise. I've used too many words there. And it's not to do with pronouns. It's to do with other word choices that I'm using just in my first draft, and that's fine. And then as I refine it over and over again, I continue to see places where I can shorten it up. So you might have some lengthy, complex sentences. They may be overly long. It's often if they're like onto the third and fourth line, it's probably too big of an idea to get across in one sentence. So one sentence is one idea. So if you have like many ideas all together, the reader will get confused. And there's no need for that there's no prize for writing the longest sentences. So we might as well shorten them when they are too long and they're going to be confusing for the reader. Perhaps splitting the sentence, or perhaps, just shortening it up in order to make it less wordy. And that might mean reducing the adjectives and adverbs, and perhaps you've got some awkward phrasing, see how you can work that out. Reversing, flipping the sentence. Sometimes just think, what am I trying to say in this sentence? And just rewrite the whole thing. Often, if you just ask yourself that question, you can come up with a much more straightforward sentence. So here we have a complex sentence, right? It covers many lines. Even if we were to see it in a Word doc in the more standard formatting, we would see that it was too long. And we can see that even now, just looking at the PowerPoint. And we do have a semicolon there, and that's a good thing to break it up, as well as an M dash. But it's still got a lot of ideas in it that might be broken down. We have become overused to viewing Indonesia as a site of political domination. It remains, so we've got an it. We know that we mean Indonesia, but we might further clarify, right? The Indonesian government remains, or Indonesian political alliances remain, or something like that. There might be a way to more deeply indicate what you mean about Indonesia there, instead of that it remains equally a place of contestation in the contentious politics. So we could end it there. It remains equally a place of contestation. This is because, or it is, it's hard to do right in the moment, but the politics of street protests and social movements have become central to political life, and in the perpetual friction that occurs between oligarchic, popular, and other interests within arenas like parliaments, parties, and electoral politics. Okay, so this is getting a little bit out of control. I would say breaking this up into 2 or 3 sentences to really clarify. And this is, a published work, and we can always, get away with some lengthy sentences, but we want to do our best for our readers to make everything as clear as we can before we submit. So there's active and passive voice. You probably have heard of, and you probably also heard correctly that active is more often which way you want to go. So you want to have the subject, the noun that occurs before the verb. You want that to be doing the action. So the engineer researched the problem is active because it is that noun doing the action. The noun is the engineer, and the engineer person is doing something, researching. So that's active. The problem was researched by the engineer or not. We don't have the actor before the verb. We have the actor implied or after the verb, and that makes it passive. So things are easier and smoother to read when the noun, the actor, is doing the action. So when you can write that way, you want to, but sometimes it's not always possible, and that's okay. For quite a bit of method, sometimes it's okay to use passive. That's a little bit more in the sciences than in HAS. And in some literature, you end up using passive voice, and that's often okay. But where you can, if you notice you're using a lot of passive, and you can change it to active, and that works well, then you probably want to do that because it will be a smoother reading experience. Okay, so we've got some examples here. For years, American policymakers have expected that. Instead of for years, it has been expected by American policymakers. You can see it's easier to read in the active. For years, and it's shorter. American policymakers have expected that. We've got the subject, the noun that is doing the verb. The policymakers are expecting something. So we've got our subject before the verb instead of having it come later. The closer you can get your subject to your verb, the more clear your sentence will be, basically. Okay, so thinking about conciseness and just, using, sometimes we, use those longer phrases made up of tiny words when we can just use one word or less words. So you might go through and check that you're using, that you're not using those long short phrases. Sometimes it's often we call them not all of these, but phrasal verbs, little small verb phrases when you can use one instead. Like to make better, you could just say improve, for example. Okay, and engaging your reader, engaging markers. Again, these are more sparingly used, but when they are used, it is powerful. So second person pronouns or imperatives or question forms and asides. So it's rare that you would use you or your, because that seems quite informal. Imperatives might be a powerful thing that you might use, particularly in your conclusion. As you can see from these examples, or question forms and asides. So let's see about some examples there. It is worth recalling. Let's put them all up. It is worth recalling that. Sounds like an aside. Example, are these ideologies similar enough? So a question form, and that can be, that is engaging. You can see when you're asked a question, when you're directly addressed, when you're given that kind of aside, it is directly engaging to the reader. It is hard to imagine how otherwise one could come to an assessment. So again, that sounds like an aside. So think about how you might use those, and using those imperatives might be really powerful in your conclusion to say, a better understanding of X is necessary, is crucial. Future studies, should focus on this or must focus on this, if you feel really strongly. So, then thinking about your vocabulary choice, you want to lift the reader confidence in your authority. You want to really build your vocabulary, invigorate your language as best you can. If you notice you keep using the same words, I did that in my thesis, and then I would do the find function and try to, use those synonyms instead, avoiding clichés as best you can. Avoiding informal language. Some students often use like kind of vague informal language, such as nowadays, and that's just like imprecise, right? That kind of language is not very clear exactly what time frame you mean. What does nowadays mean? 50 years ago, a week ago, what is nowadays? We don't know. It's not precise enough. So using that precise language. So engaging vocabulary, perhaps this sounds flowery to you and you wouldn't use it, or perhaps this sounds like this is a good way to go. But these reforms did not herald the long-awaited transition. Okay, so I feel like that herald word is a more unique word we don't read very often, that can be considered lifting the reader's confidence, engagement in your writing. Not to say every word should be sprinkled with it, every sentence should be sprinkled with these kinds of choices and leaning into the more flowery writing mode, but a well-chosen, unique word might be, quite called for and engaging to the reader. Instead, and again, that it could be better explained, envisages the evolution of a multipolar system in which several giant states jostle for influence in the style of traditional European diplomacy. So I think that word jostle is the special, unique word there. Maybe giant states, to talk about them that way, is maybe a bit unique. Envisages maybe the evolution, but I think jostle is really the word there. That is quite really precise, quite captures what the author probably wants us to imagine in terms of this this conflict, this fight for influence. It's not quite a conflict, it's not quite a fight. More of that jostling helps us to understand and really picture what they want us to in terms of this conflict over who is going to get this influence. Okay, so to wrap up, you want to, think about all of these things for that final level of your editing process in terms of being authoritative, coherent, precise, concise, and engaging. Remember, we've got to start with this level in terms of argument, structure, paragraphing, expression. Don't go right to expression. In terms of your proofreading, something you might want to do if you're very concerned about typos and all of that, you might read it aloud, a particular chapter maybe, or if you have the time, read it aloud with frequent breaks just to check for typos. That often helps you when you read to yourself in your mind. You can skip a lot. It's often suggested to read backwards, like read each sentence forward, but read it like at the end of your introduction chapter, read that last sentence, then read the second sentence, then read the third sentence from the bottom, in order to not be caught up in the nice flow that you have created and just kind of skip over some typos. But if you read the sentences out of order, it's easier to pick up on any typos. You might want to also use that find, replace function in Word in order to, make sure if you've spelled a certain word wrong, or if you use Z's instead of S's, if you're from a country like I am where they use Z's and you've used them by mistake, to change them to S, all of that, these tools can help you. So we would love to see you at Academic Skills. Please come and visit a learning advisor and we can help you with some more tips for this editing process. So if you want to talk through anything, or if you want us to certainly look over a chapter and give you some feedback, we will use this structure. We will first think about argument, then structure, and that's usually all we get to when we talk to students. And it's rare that we're, really digging into paragraphing and expression, because there's so much more important things to talk about at that top level of argument and structure. But it's very valuable to get that feedback. And again, it's valuable for you to be able to do your own self-editing. So best of luck with your editing and polishing of your humanities or social science thesis. And I hope to see you soon.